Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to go over subconscious forms in a much more general way. So hopefully you understood the last video, understood the concept of the connection between form intentions and subconscious forms and the reflection principle. Because now we're going to look at it in a more wider, more general way. So to start things off, I basically want to say that just go off of this first point, so real world environments are able to contain arrangement patterns that approximate subconscious forms. And that refers to concrete and abstract forms, which we'll discuss. So basically what I'm saying there is exactly what Socrates said. So Socrates, Plato, they said that real-world objects can participate or imitate or approximate forms in the metaphysical reality. And that's exactly true. That's exactly how I look at it too. So when I say real-world environments are able to contain arrangement patterns that approximate subconscious forms, what I'm saying is that their real-world objects can arrange themselves in a very specific and special way that is sort of dictated by God to say that when you arrange something in this pattern, right, it matches this frequency, or what our subconscious would alter our perception to perceive on some particular frequency. And I'll explain a little bit of that here. But basically, that's very important, right? Because it says that basically what this idea is saying is that God is the one who's determined, like, how you should feel about certain things when they're arranged in a certain way. And just to go back to the circle example, so God is the one who determines specifically that specific arrangement pattern should be what you see when your conscious mind produces a particular intention. And when you see something in the physical world that's very similar to that arrangement pattern, when you produce that intention, you get inspired to produce the intention that reflects a circle. So, and there may be a certain feeling or emotion that you feel, that you also feel when you produce the intention of a circle. I feel like when I think of a circle, I feel a sense of, how would I describe it? I feel a sense of continuity, right? Almost like never-endingness, right? And it feels very smooth. It feels like it flows. When I think of a square, right, it feels very, very hard for some reason. It feels extremely hard. I don't know why. But that shows that even shapes, so when you produce an intention that expresses some shape or subconscious form representing a geometric pattern, such as a shape or such as a square or circle, that also has an associated feeling. So even shapes can kind of help you lock on to certain feelings or emotions or charge certain emotions. And that feeling, again, is determined by God. So, but going into more, going beyond geometric shapes, let's look at a room. So here it says a messy room inspires you to produce the messiness or chaos intention. So for just as an example, let's say you look at a room, it's very messy, right? So you see all types of things all over the place. So there's clothes, there's food, there's, I guess you could say toys, I don't know. There's just all types of things all over the place, right? What do you think? Is it easy to look at a room like that and then say, oh, that's a clean room, or that's very orderly, right? It's hard to. Now it's hard to because God is the one who determined that when you see a room that looks like that, right, you're going to feel like it's messy, right? We'll talk more about where opinions come from. I could have the opinion, yes, that's not messy. That's a little different. But more specifically, God is the one who determined what messiness and what chaos looks like, right? If you go to a city, right, or some city street and you see everything, you see junk all over the place, cars in the middle of the street, people just walking not in an orderly way, like on this sidewalk and this sidewalk, they're walking all across the street. There's all types of things just in the street. You're going to think of chaos, right? And it's hard not to, right? You're inspired to think of chaos. When you see a messy room, you're inspired to think of a messy room. No one sees a very messy room and says, oh man, that room is really clean, right? Or it's really tidy, right? They can try to convince themselves that it is, but their initial response and their most pure response is going to be that it's messy. The more messy it actually is, or the more chaotic it is. Where that comes from is that the room is arranged in a specific way that God has determined is actually messy, right? It goes beyond your opinion of what messiness and chaos is, right? So the more it looks messy or the more chaotic it looks, the more you'll be inspired to produce that intention. In other words, the room has a particular arrangement pattern that approximates the subconscious form of chaos. So, for example, if I produce an intention, right, and this includes both abstract and concrete, because when I look at a room, the abstract component is going to express what the purpose of certain things I see on the floor are and where they're supposed to be. So the abstract, if I see food on the floor, the abstract component of my intention will express that's food, right? That can decay and get bacteria, right, and things like that. It should be in the garbage. The concrete component's not going to tell me that. The concrete component's just going to tell me physically what the food looks like and smells like and things like that, or tastes like. But the abstract component tells me its purpose, its history, what happens to it if it stays there, where it's supposed to be, all of that. So when you incorporate all of that information to everything you see in the room and everything you see on the floor, you get a specific context, right? And so we talked about that in previous video. My intention, the sum of the three command components can be expressed as its context, right? And the context of the room can be messy or express messiness. And as it looks more and more and more, or has an arrangement pattern that goes closer and closer and closer to what you might call the ideal messiness or ideal chaos, the more inspired will be to produce an intention whose context or whose command components cause my subconscious to switch to the frequency of chaos or messiness, right? So on that frequency, my perception is altered to perceive chaos, right? So it perceives a particular arrangement pattern, right? And the more closer the room looks to that arrangement pattern, the more inspired I'll be to produce that the intention that switches my subconscious to frequency of messiness and alters my perception to perceive chaos, right? So that's very important. Similarly, if a room is very tidy, if it's very clean and it's very organized, right? Or if you go to a city block and it's very organized, everything looks like it's where it's supposed to be, right? It's very orderly. I will become inspired to produce the intention associated with the subconscious form of order or the subconscious form of tidiness, right? And so, once again, that's the what I'm observing has a particular arrangement pattern that inspires me to produce an intention that switches my subconscious to the frequency that allows me to perceive orderliness or perceive things as tidy, right? And it has to be on a frequency for me to perceive something in that context, right? And so again, the more some real world environment has an arrangement pattern, whether that be messiness or tidiness, but the more it has an arrangement pattern that approximates a subconscious form, so it has an arrangement pattern that's very similar to what I would see if my subconscious switched to a certain frequency, then the more likely I'll be inspired to produce an intention that matches that frequency, right? So that's very important. So that's basically the much more general version of what we were talking about with the ellipse and the circle. So I'll just say it again because I want to really drill it in. Real-world environments are able to have very special arrangement patterns, right, which are determined by God, that approximate subconscious forms. Or more specifically, they are able to inspire you, right, to produce an intention that allows you to both feel a certain way, but perceive a particular, a particular ideal, right? And that ideal is the subconscious form, right? So that's how it works. So in other words, in real world environments, the better they approximate, because they can, I don't think I said that, they can approximate subconscious forms on a scale, right? So they can be a better and better approximation of that form, or they can be a less and less and less good approximation of that form. So exactly what we said for the ellipse. So as an ellipse gets its centricity that's closer to 1, it's a worse and worse and worse approximation of the subconscious form of a circle. The closer that ellipse, the eccentricity of the ellipse gets to 0, the better approximation it is of the subconscious form circle, and the more likely it is to inspire me to produce the form intention associated with the circle. So a messy room is the same way. So if it's a little bit messy but not that messy, it's not as good of an approximation of the messiness intention. So it's not going to inspire me. In other words, when I say it's not as good an approximation of the messiness intention, what I mean is the room doesn't look that much like what I would perceive if I produce the form intension of messiness. So if I've produced the ideal intention that purely expresses messiness, right, my subconscious will alter my perception to perceive something, right? The room doesn't look that much like what I would perceive when I produce that pure intention. But it looks a little bit like it, but not that much. So it might inspire me a little bit to produce that intention, but not that much, right? And remember what I said, the way that works is similar to what I said about it, the rule of attention. So the more attention you put into something, actually no, that it is related to intention, but it's more specifically related to what I call the purity of a charge, which we haven't really spoke about yet. We'll talk about that in chapter 12. But suffice it to say, the purity of the charge wouldn't be that high if the room is only a little bit messy. Now, as the room gets more and more messy, it becomes a better and better approximation of what I would see if I produce a very pure intention of messiness, right? And as it becomes a better and better approximation, it'll inspire me more and more, right? And then when it's just purely messy, right, a perfect approximation of the messiness intention, then it very strongly inspires me to produce the messiness intention, right, which is a subconscious form. So I produce the form intention of messiness, and it becomes a subconscious form. So as you can see, even going back to the original definition, you can see that because of that scale, right, you can see that the messiness intention or the messiness subconscious form is the endpoint of a sequence of messiness intentions. So in other words, based on the reflection principle, when I look at a room that's a little bit messy, I'll produce an intention that expresses a little bit of messiness, right? I don't feel it that much though, so I'm not as disgusted, right, when I see that room. But as the room gets messier and messier and messier, through the reflection principle, I'll produce an intention that's more and more and more purely messy until it's the pure messiness intention. So it represents the endpoint of a sequence of intentions. So you can do that with a messy room that's getting more and more messy. You could do it with a tidy room that's getting more and more tidy or clean. And you can do it with pretty much all types of things. So in this example, we looked at the concept of a room. We looked at geometric shapes where that happens. You can even do it with things that we consider beautiful. So beauty is a very important concept in Plato's idea of forms as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about beauty later because I want to talk about beauty in the context of opinions. But beautiful things inspire you to produce the beauty form intention. So even beauty is a form intention. So it's a subconscious frequency, right? When you see things that you consider beautiful, so whether it be a girl, right? So you can see a girl that's beautiful, you can see a car that's beautiful, you can see jewelry that's beautiful, you can see poetry that's beautiful, you can hear poetry that's beautiful or music. It's all the same thing. Now these are very different things, right? So why do we call all of them beautiful despite how different they are? It's because our subconscious is on the same frequency. It doesn't matter, right, whether it's physical or abstract, right? When our subconscious switches to a certain frequency, we recognize that frequency and we call it beauty. So beauty is actually an emotion. It's an emotional feeling, right? And we don't normally think of beauty as an emotion, but you have to get used to thinking in terms of the subconscious, right? The mechanics of the subconscious mind. And yes, beauty is a feeling or an emotion, and that emotion is associated with a specific frequency. So when our subconscious switches to the beauty frequency, our perception gets altered to perceive a very specific arrangement pattern. That arrangement pattern is the one God has determined is associated with things that are beautiful, right? So, and that's why a person could be beautiful. A car, or usually new things, lustrous things, but a car, jewelry, nature, these things can be beautiful, right? And they're beautiful in a way that God has determined is beautiful, right? It'd be very difficult for me to look at a landfill full of garbage, right, and call it beautiful. I could do it, but it's hard. We'll talk more about how that works a little later. But all of these things, and this shows us that God made it so that concrete things can be beautiful and abstract things can be beautiful. So an abstract thing, for example, would be poetry, the arrangement pattern of words, right, or the arrangement of ideas. That can still be beautiful. But whether we're talking about physical things that have arrangement pattern or abstract things, they all are arranged in a specific way that approximates the subconscious form of beauty, right? So, I'm trying to think of anything else I want to say, because we're going to talk about this later, too. But yeah, I think that's it. Um, and yeah, actually, just to say one more thing. So let's take music, for example. So music can be beautiful. So I can make it so that music could be a good approximation of the subconscious form beauty or bad approximation, and it occurs on a scale. So if I do certain things with my music, right, it might not be that beautiful, but a little bit beautiful. So it's a decent, an okay approximation of subconscious form beauty, but not that much. So when you hear it, you might feel a little like it's beautiful, but not that much. In other words, it doesn't inspire you to produce the beauty intention very purely. And as I change things with it and I make it sound more and more beautiful, right, it inspires you more and more and more to produce the subconscious form beauty, right? So it becomes a better approximation of the subconscious form beauty. The better the approximation of the subconscious form, the more it inspires you to produce the form intention. So in other words, this is all important because subconscious forms, in other words, help us to charge our subconscious in certain ways. If I wanted to charge the beauty frequency, it would be a lot easier if I just look at beautiful things or imagine beautiful things. It would be easier for me to charge the beauty intention. By the same token, right, let's say I'm not consciously trying to charge the beauty intention, right, or the beauty frequency. Because I can't turn my subconscious off, and because of the attention principle we talked about before, which is basically that your subconscious basically has no choice but to charge up based on what you're paying attention to. And so if I keep paying attention to beautiful things that keep inspiring me to kind of switch to the beauty frequency, I'm going to charge up at the beauty frequency at least a little bit, whether I want to or not. So things you constantly observe and give your attention to are constantly affecting how your subconscious charges. And they do that on the basis of how accurately they approximate some subconscious form. Right? So now getting here, we're going to get more into abstract. So we've talked a lot about concrete forms, mostly, which are physical things. With beauty, we talked a little bit about abstract forms, but because beauty can be both abstract and concrete. But now we're going to talk a little more about abstract forms. So I'll just go over this next point. Interactions you observe in the real world can also approximate abstract subconscious forms. So that's important too, because let's say I'm looking at two people, right? Remember what I said, the abstract command component of your intention expresses relationships, and it can express information, it can express history, things like that, and descriptions and just knowledge or information in general. But really, what's really important though about that is how it expresses relationships. So if I see two people interacting, right, and I say, oh, they look very friendly, what does that mean? That means that their interaction it has an arrangement pattern, not so much physically, but it has an arrangement pattern in terms of information. In other words, when we're looking at them, and through the reflection principle, our intention is expressing information about how they're interacting and about their relationship to each other. It can express itself in a certain way that approximates, let's say, the friendship subconscious form or the friendship frequency. Because once again, I don't know if I said it before, friendship is actually a feeling. It's an emotion. So when you feel like two people are really good friends, you feel a certain way. That's an emotion, right? We'll call that the friendship emotion or the friendship feeling. And on that subconscious frequency of friendship, not only do you feel the emotion of friendship, but you're able to perceive the relationship associated with friendship. And as two people interact, right, and you're sort of saving and you're observing how they interact, and you're sort of expressing certain information about the parameters of their relationship, those parameters, in a sense, represents an arrangement pattern, not physically, but in a more abstract way. It represents the information that you're assigning to their, let's just say their connection to each other, because I want to use the relationship. But more, yeah, I'll just say to the parameters you're assigning to the relationship they have with each other, which you assign based on what you're observing in terms of how they're interacting, that in its own way is an arrangement pattern that can match different types of relationships or subconscious forms or abstract subconscious forms. So if two people are interacting and they're laughing and they're hanging out, and I know that they like to hang out with each other, and I know that they support each other all the time and things like that, I would say that they're friends. Why? Because that information, the abstract command component of my intention that I produce when I think of them, right, has an arrangement pattern that matches the friendship frequency or the friendship subconscious form. if I see two people that hate each other, always sort of fight each other when they see each other, don't like each other, they got into it for this and that, when my intention expresses the parameters of that relationship, it has an arrangement pattern that matches the subconscious form of enemies, right? So when I express that intention to describe the relationship, my subconscious will switch to a specific frequency, which on that frequency I perceive them as being enemies, and I feel the frequency, the emotion of being an enemy. Same thing with the hero and the civilian, right? If I see Superman, right, coming down from the sky, saving someone, my intention will express certain parameters of that relationship. Now, I'm not trying to express the relationship of hero. I'm not holding intention, think hero, think hero. No, I'm just observing what they're doing and expressing information that I think matches the parameters of the relationship between the hero and civilian. That those parameters will have some arrangement pattern that matches some subconscious frequency. And the more closely, right, that relationship or the information I'm expressing from what I'm observing fits a particular arrangement pattern of hero or the relationship between hero and civilian, the more it better approximates it, the more inspired I'll become to produce the form intention associated with being a hero. So in other words, and the same thing with Boston Workers, so abstract things you observe in the real world, including specifically relationships you observe in the real world, can also contain arrangement patterns, right? And that, again, that's just from you looking at it and producing intention to sort of approximate, is you produce an intention that expresses the relationship parameters you think you're observing, right? So that's a pattern too. But they express arrangement patterns that approximate abstract subconscious forms. Now, the important thing about abstract subconscious forms, well, really with all subconscious forms, but particularly the one I kind of more interested in is abstract ones, is, just to go over this next point, abstract forms help us to know ideal definitions on a conscious level. In a sense, subconscious forms are like the subconscious mind's version of words. So what do I mean by that? Basically, the way the conscious mind defines words is different from the way the subconscious mind defines words. And it's very important to be aware of that difference when understanding the subconscious mind. The conscious mind can define a word any way it feels like. It can just make up a word and it can mean anything, right? So I could take the word sky. Most people think of sky as the thing we see when we look up outside, right? The atmosphere. But I can just as easily define the word sky to mean what we normally call a book. I could define sky to mean a bed. I could define sky to mean the ground, right? So the conscious mind could define sky to mean anything it wants to mean. The subconscious mind is different, or the positive mind. The positive mind, you can't pick and choose however you want a word, whatever you want the word to mean, right? No, the words by the subconscious mind are completely universal. Everyone has the same definition, and the words from the subconscious mind are determined by God, right? And they can't be changed or altered. So that's why it's so important to understand subconscious forms, because they basically are like words to the subconscious mind. Things that are beautiful to the subconscious or inspire you to switch to the beauty frequency are fixed. God is the one who's determined what beautiful things look like. I know there are different opinions on what's beauty, and we're going to talk about that, I think, in the next video. But no, beauty is something determined and is fixed, and that's determined by God. In heaven, there are only beautiful things. You won't be able to just picture anything you feel like, right? Well, we haven't gotten to spiritual things yet. But just assuming, what most people think of as heaven, right? They're probably not going to be a whole bunch of, like, harsh or, let's say, ugly music, for example, right? It's going to be just beautiful music. Why? Is that because, can you just pick what we would normally consider, like, ugly, harsh music and call it beautiful, and then you'll hear that in heaven? Like, I doubt it, right? It's going to be just beautiful things, because God is the one who determined what beauty is, right? That's fixed. So, the conscious mind can pick whatever it wants to be a definition for whatever word it wants to, but the subconscious mind's words are fixed. So how do we know how something is defined? How do we know how the subconscious mind defines some particular word? Well, we know based on this process. So how we feel and how much we get inspired by a particular feeling, and how pure our subconscious charge is at some frequency. I didn't mention it before, But forms can also be mixed, just like subconscious frequencies can be mixed. So a messy room, for example, can be a little bit messy, but it also can be a little bit clean, right? So it can actually inspire you. They would be antithetical to each other, but it can inspire you to produce both frequencies. A room could be clean and beautiful, for example, right? And it will inspire you to produce both frequencies. A relationship can be, two people can be friends, but also workers. So it can inspire you to produce both frequencies or subconscious forms. But you would still know how subconscious defines a particular word based on how purely and how much it inspires you to produce a particular frequency or to switch to a particular frequency. Excuse me. So for example, let's take two people who are friends, right? The conscious mind might define friends in some way based on, I haven't really thought about it, but some way based on saying that they support each other based on certain parameters, right? Friends are two people who generally like each other's company and support each other and sort of help each other or something like that, right? Now, let's say my conscious mind just says two friends are people who generally like each other's company, who hang out a lot, who support each other, but also physically hurt each other lots of times. Well, that's not like normally the way a friendship is defined. That last point doesn't make any sense. But let's say my conscious mind says that that's what a friendship is, right? Now, when I focus on two people who are friends, when I think of them as being people who like to generally like each other's company and support each other and hang out a lot, but I will feel the friendship feeling. But the moment I say they also are very violent to each other, you're gonna notice that friendship feeling goes away very quickly. It's very hard to hold on to that feeling when your intention says that some relationship contains that parameter that they like to hurt each other. Why does that happen? Because that relationship parameter is not part of the ideal friendship that's determined by God, right? So the moment my intention expresses that parameter, my subconscious switches to some frequency that allows me to perceive that parameter, but it can't be that deep on the subconscious, on the friendship frequency if I do that. It has to go away from it. And you can practice this, right? So if you think of two people as friends and you feel that friendship feeling, just then say in your mind that while they have all these different parameters that make them friendly, pick some parameter that you know is not native to the idea of a good friendship. They like to hurt each other or they lie to each other all the time. You can notice that friendship feeling, it goes away immediately. And it's nearly impossible to hold on to it because your subconscious won't let you, right? It won't let you because your intention expressed some parameter not native to the friendship frequency. And your subconscious switches to whatever frequency it needs to be on for you to perceive that parameter. Do you remember what I said? Relationships, your subconscious has to be on a particular frequency in order for you to perceive certain relationships, right? So, and you could pick any word, right? And so this is also how when Socrates was talking about forms, right? So he even said the same thing. Forms represent ideals in the metaphysical world, right? And people create opinions about these things, but as they get more truth, they sort of appeal more or focus more on the metaphysical definition or unchanging truth in the metaphysical world. And that's pretty much true in the sense that's pretty much true, but I'm talking about these things more in terms of the subconscious, right? So if you pick the feeling of loyalty, right? So you could say the conscious mind can define loyalty, let's say or it normally defines loyalty as someone who is very devoted to supporting you, right? And it's very difficult for them to walk away or stop supporting you. They're loyal, right? Now, if I say my conscious mind says loyalty is someone who tries to cheat you and will stop supporting you right away, right? You're not going to feel that emotion you normally feel when you think of loyalty. So my conscious mind can make up whatever word it wants to, define it however it wants to, but the feeling, right? The subconscious feeling or emotion you produce, that's what determines the word. That's how the subconscious defines the word. Now, I will know what the ideal loyalty is or what loyalty ideally is when my attention expresses certain parameters of some relationship. And then after expressing those parameters, if that feeling or emotion of loyalty comes in more strongly or more purely, then I know that is the proper or the ideal relationship or the ideal definition of loyalty or the ideal set of behaviors associated with loyalty. If my intention expresses certain relationship parameters or behaviors, and that feeling, that emotion of loyalty goes away when I do it, then I know that whatever I expressed was not the ideal set of parameters or behaviors associated with loyalty. So that's very important. That's how the subconscious defines words. And you can do that with any sort of, any word, subconscious word, or any word or relationship that we normally think of on a conscious level. So for Plato or Socrates, they would think of, like, what's the ideal relationship between the government and the citizen? You could do the same thing. You could focus on some feeling you generally have when you think of what a government's supposed to do, and then if your intention expresses certain parameters or behaviors associated with the government, there's some feeling you're gonna have when you do that, and that feeling is either gonna be positive or negative. And if it's positive, then you would think of this as an ideal or good version of a government, what a government's supposed to do. Now, as you express certain parameters, that feeling is going to go away. That positive feeling is going to go away. And then you might feel something negative or something that you might think has nothing to do with government. So what that means is whatever parameters you express is not the ideal government, right? Let's say you express a kleptocrat, right? So a kleptocracy. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's someone that basically kind of steals the resources of the society for themselves, or some regime, some small regime, right? Now, if you think of someone doing that, you get a very negative feeling, right? That's not a good government, or it's not an ideal government, right? Unless you're trying to make an ideal evil, unless you're trying to look for the ideal evil government. But if you want an ideal government in terms of goodness and virtue, right, then you focus on how you feel. The moment you describe a government that's a kleptocracy, that good feeling is going to go away immediately. So that's what your subconscious telling you, this is not an ideal government, which more specifically is God saying this is not an ideal government. So that process is very important. You could pick any definition or any word or any relationship, hero, villain, whatever, and you can use that same principle or that same technique to know what its ideal parameters are. And knowing those ideal parameters, you're going to understand how the subconscious defines words, right? Now, we're going to do it a little later with the concept of morality too, and virtue, because the subconscious also defines morality, right? It's not, people think that morality is just based on whatever the conscious mind makes up. No, right? It's fixed and determined by God, right? So the most important word, right, that the subconscious mind can express and that you could learn through the subconscious mind is also God, right? So God is also a word that is innately defined by your subconscious. So that is very important, and we're going to talk more about that in chapter 3 of book 2, right? So we're going to talk about how God defines the subconscious, and we're going to use this exact same process to know what the properties of God are, right? You're going to notice when you express certain ideas or certain feelings, that feeling or emotion we associate with God, which we haven't talked about that yet, but we're going to talk about that later. It's almost an emotion, but it's a little bit different from that in the case of God. But you're going to notice the feeling or connection to God comes in more strongly. When you produce certain intentions, negative ones, you're going to notice that the feeling of God gets pushed away. So when you're learning how to charge your subconscious to connect to God, which again we'll talk about in the next book, you're going to notice what intentions you have to produce and what parameters you have to produce to sort of draw nearer to God. And that's basically going to be everything good and things that you would normally expect. Basically having to do with love, peace, things like that. But you're going to notice the feeling of God coming stronger. And then as you charge that feeling more and more, you draw nearer to God, and it feels more and more amazing, right? So that's pretty much it for subconscious form. The last thing I want to say, just one other thing, again, having to do with spirituality, which we'll talk about later, it's kind of what I was mentioning in the previous video. So music, right, and I feel this is important to say because there's a lot of misunderstanding about music. People keep thinking that they can listen to evil or negative music and that it's just like their opinion, you know what I mean, or people's opinion that it's bad. It isn't, right? Music can contain an arrangement pattern that is negative, right, that has determined by God, right, and it pushes you away from God. It just has, if you produce any frequency or any intention that expresses parameters that are not associated with the word God as defined by your subconscious is going to switch away, or your subconscious is going to move away from God. Again, this doesn't make as much sense because we haven't talked about it yet, but just know that when you produce negative intentions or focus on things that have negative arrangement patterns, right, or that approximate negative subconscious forms. Like a negative subconscious form could be hate, for example, right? If you see like a racist person, if you see the way a racist person believes, if your intention expresses the beliefs that a racist person has about a minority or some other race, and you see the way they treat them, for example, that when your intention expresses those relationship parameters and those beliefs, it obtains a particular arrangement pattern that fits the subconscious form of hate, right? Hate is a negative subconscious frequency, right? That pushes you away from God. And so music can have arrangement patterns that are inherently negative. These stupid music videos that you see, which have all this stupid demonic imagery, those are arrangement patterns that, upon the reflection principle, when you produce an intention that reflects the arrangement pattern that you're seeing concretely and the arrangement pattern that you're hearing abstractly, those all cause your subconscious to charge at a negative frequency and pushes you away from God. So I just thought that was important to say. We're going to talk a little more about that probably in chapter 5 of book 2, where we talk about negative entities and things like that. But this is important. So when you listen to music that talks about drugs and talks about like promiscuous sex and licentious, lascivious behavior. I can never say that word, lascivious, right? But lascivious, or I think it's something like that. But when you see music videos that talk about these things, they talk about lying and they talk about being extremely self-centered and focusing on money and having a huge ego and things like this. All of these things cause your subconscious to charge up at negative frequencies that push you away from God, right? And people don't know that. I see it all the time, right? You have no. I'm actually going to show you guys in a later video some of these stuff I've seen in stores, right? Because people don't realize that all these stupid things in culture they're constantly surrounded by things that keep causing their subconscious to charge at a negative frequency. It's basically, like I said before, a form of subliminal messaging. Like I've seen. It's on my phone. I gotta find it. But it's on my old phone. But I've seen this store that was basically having these images, right, of not only just talking about money, they were talking about it like in a satanic way, right? And it's planting this idea in a person's mind that this stuff is cool. And so when you see that by the reflection principle, you're producing an intention that matches what you're observing. And when you're surrounded by enough things that make it look cool, usually they appeal to the danger frequency from the body, which, like I said, has contrarian behavior. So it makes you attracted to things that are bad. So they make all this stupid satanic crap look like cool in a dangerous way to make you more attracted to it, right? And now when you're surrounded by that stuff enough and you keep charging it, then you will charge it in a way that makes you more attracted to negative things. And that happens because of the way the body affects the subconscious. It pushes you away from God. So I'm actually going to make a video about that way, way, way later. We'll have to talk more about all the subconscious stuff first. There's so much we haven't spoke about. I already know all of it, right? So that's why I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit. But I just thought it's important to say some of that stuff now, right? So, but again, it'll make more sense when we talk about spirituality. Like I said, I think I got to look at the books. I want to follow the order of the book, but I think in the next video, we're going to talk a little more about opinions, where opinions come from. We're going to talk about a concept I call form morphing, right? Because that's going to be important, right? So yeah, hopefully that wasn't too bad. We're not really done with subconscious forms yet because we're still got to talk about opinions. But I know it's very, very abstract, though. Right, probably this video and the last video were a little abstract. Hopefully me breaking it up into 2 videos made it a little bit easier to understand. But again, if it's still tricky, you can watch this video and the last video and then also read the book, or read the book, that you order or the one online, to get a better idea of it. All right, but yeah, that's everything. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.